and daunting on two scores. Firstly, everybody knows him. And secondly, he's my boss. I have to be careful what I say. So, with that in mind, and as everyone does have a very good idea of who Mark is, I thought I'd add one little insight that I picked up over the last short while, um, relating to where Mark is at. I think, Mark, was it August last year that you took the reins
So
of
yeah,
Julia?
September, I think.
Okay. And I remember she said, and I'm going to read it because I remember it exactly. She said the person who was going to take the reins needed to be someone whose whole life was logotherapy. And I thought that pretty apt because at the time you had your logo theatre and you also had your logo clients. And that was full time what you did, which was the essence of what you were saying. But since then, I've come to realize that there's another dimension that exists in terms of Mark's commitment to logotherapy. And it came to me when I attended an online session with you, Alison, and your community in Ribe Castile. And there was a whole group of people and having a discussion. And I came to understand the extent to which Mark has infused logotherapy into his community. So not only is it part of his life, but he's also exposing it in a very real way. The people who spoke felt like they'd studied logotherapy. I could learn from them. The way they framed things was absolutely spot on in terms of their understanding of and integrating their lives into logotherapy. So while Turia made a good choice at the time, the best choice, I might add, that dimension puts a whole new spin on it because it's starting to sound like, Mark, you're starting a bit of a revolution down there. And it's going to spread up here, hopefully. um, the topic for tonight is atheism and the unconscious God. And for a whole variety of reasons, firstly, it's a very tricky concept to understand. In my years in logotherapy, I've realized that the minute the word God comes into it, it starts becoming quite difficult to understand, and people have different ideas of it. Not just to say that it's not an easy topic, it's very misunderstood. And for a variety of reasons, Mark, no one is better pitched to help us down that road than you are. So over to you.
Thank you, Coral. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'd just again like to express my appreciation for the incredible support that I have from all the supervisors. And Coral has stepped up to create some new wonderful initiatives, which I know some of you know about at the Viktor Frankl Institute. So I feel extremely blessed to have the people that we have at the Institute working together as a wonderful team, which is what we are. You say that I'm your boss, Coral, but I don't think that's true. I think we are a team, and we work together, and we are the bosses of each other and the colleagues of each other. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's a daunting subject, not only because it's a concept that is difficult to understand, but that it's also obviously atheism has the potential to be controversial. So I've come to this topic with some trepidation, and I've had several false starts in setting out how I was going to approach it. And I started by trying to take quite an academic approach to the subject, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And then I realized that the only way to get the message across that I think is important, or the several messages that I think are important, is to tell my own story, is to tell the story of atheism, my atheism and unconscious God, from my own perspective. Now, that obviously means that there is quite a lot of personal information contained in this talk about me, which is really about my own journey as an atheist from somebody who not only did not believe in God, but also eschewed anything to do with the notion of a spiritual dimension. I was actively anti being a spiritual human being. And through logotherapy, which you will discover in the journey which I'm going to share with you, that has been a completely life-changing experience for me. So obviously a little bit of a, not a disclaimer, but because, I'm going to be talking from a very, very personal perspective, there are going to be some things. So I have to tell you, there's a lot of religion, obviously. There's a bit of politics. There's a bit of sex. There's a bit of substance abuse. So we've got all the difficult subjects thrown in. I just want to be very clear that it's not my intention to make anybody uncomfortable. But some of the stuff is, it's out there. And I'd like to just quote here Viktor Frankl when he said, with his tongue only slightly in his cheek, that the difference between psychoanalysis and logotherapy is that in psychoanalysis, the client has to say things that are hard to say. In logotherapy, the client often has to hear things that are hard to hear. And while I'm not saying these things are hard to hear, I'm hoping that that the sharing of my particular experiences and my journey towards a wonderful place in my life will provoke some thought and some interesting dialogue. I think it's a subject which we tend to skirt around, and I'm going to dive right in. So here we go. I was born an atheist, as is every single human being on the planet. Okay? We may enter the world as spiritual beings, but none of us arrives on earth believing in a God. The journey towards religious belief begins after birth and is usually driven by the family we are born into and frequently by geographical location. My particular circumstances on both counts dictated that I was to be made to believe in the God of the Christian faith under the auspices of the Presbyterian Church, into which my parents, their parents, and their parents before them had been born, baptized, and raised, and in whose shadow they lived their lives, not out of any discernible deep conviction, but because it was what good people did. Consequently, I was baptized and sent to Sunday school without my permission, but when the time came for me to start attending confirmation classes, I balked. So throughout my childhood, I had seen myself as vaguely religious, as did most of my peers in the mind-numbing period of Christian national education in South Africa. However, I'd also begun to realize that I was something which had to exist in the shadows, beyond the fringes of society, and which Christianity decried as wrong and even evil. As I felt neither, the only logical conclusion that I could reach was that Christianity was wrong about me and other things, including apartheid, which, despite my complete insulation from reality, courtesy of the nationalist government, I had started to discern was both wrong and evil, the two things I was beginning to understand I would be labeled as should my secret be discovered. It was a confusing and very frightening period, and as with millions of others like me at the time, and tragically for further millions for whom this is still the case in 2026, there was nowhere to turn for advice, comfort, or support. One day in an early high school religious instruction class, the kind, pretty young teacher on whom I had a schoolboy crush, despite my aberration, took it upon herself to deviate from the curriculum prescribed by the Transvaal Education Department in order to deliver a talk on the dangers people of different sexual orientation posed to our young Christian minds. It had obviously not entered hers that any of the shiny-faced youth sitting in front of her could be such an abomination, especially not me, a somewhat nerdy boy with acne who was trying with rapidly diminishing success to fly under the radar as much as possible. The RI teacher, her pretty face contorted with anger and disgust, as she exhorted us to ostracize anyone who may be of that persuasion, and railed that it was our Christian duty to make sure they were hounded out of society, was suddenly no longer my crush. At the age of 14, in 1976, a watershed year for the country and me, I had an epiphany. I knew with absolute clarity that this woman, using her religion as a springboard for hatred, was wrong. That my friends who told endless jokes about queers, for which I hated myself for my own dutiful laughter, were wrong. And most importantly, I had a vague notion that what I was illegal. But so were black people sitting on benches and using shop entrances were reserved for whites, which meant that what was legal was clearly also frequently morally wrong. So I'm one of the very few lucky members of the LGBTQ plus community who started my survival journey in adolescence. Consciously stepping into my own moral truth, stripped from me all the self-loathing I had started to develop, to be replaced by the unequivocal belief that I had been made a certain way for a reason, and definitely not by a God, represented by the woman spewing vitriol to 32 teens who were nodding in agreement, laughing derisively and throwing the Q word around. I'd barely found a term for what I was, let alone considered that there may be others like me, but in that moment, I experienced a crystallizing of the nature of right and wrong, good and evil, as well as a surge of pride in myself. Pride that what I was couldn't be a mistake. It felt completely natural to me. I just felt right. So I was not in 1970 South Africa about to come bursting out of the closet waving my gay pride flag, terms I would not encounter until many years later. I knew that in order to continue the survival journey I had just embarked upon, what I was would have to remain a secret. The difference was that I no longer saw it as a dirty secret. I had no notion of how that secret would play out in my life. All I knew was that I was okay as I was. From that day, almost 50 years ago, to this, I have never felt a moment's shame. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for fear, which frequently caused me to hide my true nature, at which I became, as is the case with almost everyone like me, brilliantly adept. In that same moment, there arose in me with absolute clarity the realization that I would need to become responsible for my own moral development, that there was no place for me in a world whose morals were built on the dictates of a dogma, which, as I had always dimly suspected, was a human construct invented to control and order society and provide a moral blueprint for those who did not have the imagination to construct their own. Now, these thoughts, naive and uninformed as they were at the time, nevertheless became, many years later, the basis of my profoundly held beliefs, which I ultimately came to think of as atheistic responsibleness. Sadly, in the same moment as I accepted my sexuality and rejected religion, my still developing mind rejected any notion of spirituality, of which I had no concept outside the Christian construct. Bound up as it was for me with the notions of an afterlife in heaven or hell, notions which were also rejected permanently in that moment, I vowed to live a life free of the constraints, as I then saw them, of spirituality. Without knowing any of the terms, I became determined to live my life as an atheist only in the somatic and psychological dimensions of my humanness. It would take another 35 years for my second great epiphany to arrive in the form of the realization that I needed to reconcile my atheism with spirituality, a gift which was bestowed upon me by Dr. Viktor Frankl, Dr. Therese Chantal, and logotherapy. So let's fast forward to that time when, having fought several life battles in the intervening years, including overcoming alcohol abuse, I decided to expand my knowledge of human psychology. One of the first links to pop up in my Google search was to the logotherapy course run through the psychology department at UNISA. I had a vague idea who Viktor Frankl was and had heard of man's search for meaning, but logotherapy was a completely new term to me. I was intrigued, but the moment I encountered God, however unconscious, in an exploratory reading of an article, I abandoned the exploration. If God was in the picture, logotherapy was not for me. I continued my search with no success. None of the courses I researched spoke to me on any level, and I decided to completely abandon the idea furthering my studies. However, at exactly that point, logotherapy made it clear that it was not done with me. I found myself looking at it again and becoming ever more drawn in until my research brought me up against a cornerstone of its philosophy and practice, that logotherapy views the human being as three-dimensional, those dimensions being the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual. Here I stumbled again, but then I came across the word noetic, which I had not encountered before. This piqued my interest, especially when I learned that noetic was the preferred term in logotherapy in order to prevent spirituality becoming synonymous with religion. The surge of excitement I felt in that moment, I now recognize as the first tentative steps along the road towards the realization and acceptance of myself as a spiritual being. I began to delve deeper into Frankl's writing on religion and spirituality. Existential analysis aims at nothing more and nothing less than leading men to consciousness of their responsibility, he says in The Doctor and the Soul. I began to realize that for Frankl, the logotherapist's role is to help clients discover meaning and responsibility in their lives, not to prescribe religious beliefs or practices. I came across passages where he warns against confusing psychotherapy with theology, insisting that logotherapy's purpose is healing, not salvation. Salvation, he argues, belongs to the domain of faith, while healing belongs to the domain of medicine and psychology. Frankl also rejects the slavish following of religious dogma. In The Will to Meaning, he cautions against reducing spirituality to rigid formulas, noting that authentic meaning arises from personal responsibility and freedom, not blind obedience. He insists that logotherapy must remain open to all, regardless of their worldview, saying, logotherapy is not confined to believers. It addresses itself to the irreligious as well as the religious, to atheists, agnostics, and humanists alike. I was sold. Without realizing it, I had finally, in my mid-50s, found the path which would lead me to spiritual enlightenment. So I arrived at UNISA in a state of anticipation of universal like-minded upholding of Viktor Frankl's views on religion in relation to logotherapy. I soon realized it was not going to be quite as simple as that. I've alluded to some of the discrimination and prejudice I've encountered as a member of the LGBTQ plus community. What I haven't yet referenced is the discrimination, judgment, prejudice, hostility, and on occasion, even threats atheists experience from time to time at the hands of some religious individuals, groups, and organizations. While I've certainly never been threatened or faced naked hostility in the logotherapy community, subtle judgment has not been entirely absent either. My personal experience has been that there are religious, usually Christian people, thankfully a very small minority, who pay lip service to Frankl's views, but clearly do not truly believe that an individual who does not acknowledge the existence of a God within the context of established dogma can be a true logotherapist. In some instances, this extends to the view that clients need to be followers of organized religion too, in order to experience the full benefits of logotherapy. So I've encountered this sometimes unintentional and at other times brutally intentional moral superiority of believers in several contexts which require a spiritual approach, and where the word God is made use of in processes and practices. Sometimes in such organizations, an assurance is given that the word merely denotes a belief in some kind of higher power, which can be absolutely anything you want it to be. In reality, that rarely translates into respect or even a sense of safety or even comfort for non-believers. And such was my experience with Alcoholics Anonymous. It may have been the particular group I joined, but there was a lot of thanking the Christian God for recovery, and a few sour faces when I let it be known that I don't believe I had such a helpful chap in my corner. At the end of my first meeting, I was introduced to the Serenity Prayer, which I was required to speak aloud with the rest of the group. sure many of you know, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. My friend who had introduced me to the AA meeting shot me an encouraging glance. It didn't help. Floundering as I was spiritually, I had no idea what I could use to represent my higher power and could think of nothing with which to replace God in my mind. I mumbled my way through the prayer and fled, feeling worse than when I arrived. So there began to grow in me an awareness that the responsibility for giving up alcohol would have to reside with me alone. I still poo-pooed everything which even ventured near the realm of the spiritual, religious or otherwise, and I was determined to believe that nothing other than physical and psychological willpower would get me sober. However, I had discovered something: responsibility, or as I prefer to call it, responsibleness, or even another way of looking at it, response-ableness. The problem was that having become entrenched in irresponsible behavior, I had no idea how to access that ableness of responsibleness for changing those behavior patterns. I was going it alone with no program or set of rules to guide me, and I realized I would need to fall back on my imagination and creativity and the voice of my conscience. My discovery of logotherapy and my own spirituality lay in the future, but with hindsight, I can now view this period of my life as deeply significant in terms of unconsciously starting my adult journey towards spiritual awareness. It was also the beginning of clarifying and finding direction for my atheism. Consciously going it alone on my journey towards sobriety caused two meaningful shifts to occur. First one, although imagination and creativity were part of my everyday life as a theatre practitioner, I now consciously began to call on them for the processes of living. Supported by my conscience, my unique imagination and creativity gradually became my moral bedrocks and sources of inspiration and guidance for choices and actions. Secondly, my atheism, which up until then had been a somewhat lazy connection to my morality and sense of values, started to mature and develop into an active, visceral belief in responsibleness and moral accountability to myself and others, which began to manifest in action and behavior reflected through the lens of a more clearly defined moral compass. With these shifts having taken place, I continued to stumble my way through life, albeit with a greater sense of focus than before, until logotherapy found me and opened my consciousness to my spiritual dimension and my unconscious God. Now, initially, I battled with the concept of the unconscious God on two levels. Firstly, what to replace the word God with for myself, and secondly, whether the unconscious God remains unconscious after it is discovered and recognized. So my thinking was that on becoming aware of the unconscious God, it would automatically have to move into consciousness to be reflected upon, interpreted, and called upon. So it was all very confusing. So seeking clarity on both counts, I came upon the following statements from Dr. Frankl's book, The Unconscious God. He says, God is unconscious insofar as man's relation to God may be unconscious. So I'll read that again. God is unconscious insofar as man's relation to God may be unconscious. And secondly, the unconscious God is not a God who is himself unconscious. Rather, he is a God who is unconsciously present in man. The second one, the unconscious God is not a God who is himself unconscious. Rather, he is a God who is unconsciously present in man. So these statements helped clarify my understanding of Frankl's concept of unconsciousness in this context, i.e., that something can exist within us without us ever becoming fully aware of all its dimensions. But I was still unsure as how to define exactly what was unconsciously present in me. I found my answer in Man's Search for Meaning, where Frankl explores the notion that ultimate meaning is often hidden and must be discovered, and that meaning and transcendence are not consciously formulated, but are arrived at through lived experiences and responsibility. He says, the true meaning of life is to be discovered in the world rather than within man or his own psyche. This helped me to define my God as follows: my innate ability to find meaning and achieve self-transcendence through living responsibly in alignment with the not always conscious voice of my conscience. That's rather a mouthful, but this was the first time I was able to find a meaningful definition and understanding of my higher power. This defining moment in my spiritual development was strengthened by Frankl's assertion that the unconscious God speaks to everyone, including atheists who carry an unconscious orientation toward transcendence. This does not mean we must become religious. Rather, it highlights that the human spirit often reaches beyond itself in search of meaning. For Frankl, this unconscious dimension underscores the universality of logotherapy. It is about awakening responsibility and meaning, not prescribing belief. So this meeting with my unconscious God was not entirely without complexities, as it was accompanied by what I perceived to be a sense of discomfort from some of my logotherapy classmates at UNISA with those of us who professed our atheism. I was hyper aware of my sensitivity around this based on past experiences, and I tried to dismiss my observations as projection on my part. But an experience in a class brought home to me that the awkwardness I sensed from others was not entirely imagined. In the course of a group discussion, I had a revelation, which I voiced thus: it has struck me that no matter what our individual belief systems are, be they Christian, Judaic, Islamic, agnostic, or atheistic, logotherapy entrenches and affirms those beliefs for us individually in a unique and deeply meaningful way. I'm not sure why I was so surprised by this epiphany, given that logotherapy is all about discovering the unique meaning inherent in life, particularly in the noetic dimension. However, it felt like a huge revelation to me at the time, which I joyfully shared with the rest of the class. It also felt to me that I was expressing a sense of unity and connectedness with everyone in the room through the acknowledgement that our beliefs, divergent as they may have been, were irrelevant in the context of our common humanity and unique senses of purpose. The trainer was excited by my statement and opened it up to the class for discussion. An uncomfortable silence ensued. It was clear I'd struck a nerve, and that some of my classmates were not ready to engage in a discussion which would acknowledge the validity of other beliefs, particularly those which did not include God in their equation. I remained persona non grata with a small group of Christians which did not acknowledge me for the remaining many days of the course. On the flip side, a lovely, gentle man with a great sense of humor, who was a priest in the Greek Orthodox Church, approached me at the end of the class. He affirmed that there had been a reaction to my statement which had rendered discussion impossible, for which he felt sad. He also asked me to repeat it slowly, word for word, so he could write it down in order to be able to reflect on it. This he did, and we engaged in several meaningful and enlightening conversations over our lunch breaks, during which he treated my beliefs as equal in relevance, stature, and meaning to his own, and I accorded his the same respect. What was most affirming was that our differing beliefs became irrelevant, as our core values as human beings who wished for responsibility and decency in the world were completely aligned. I had not yet encountered Viktor Frankl's quote from a speech given on a Holocaust Remembrance Day, but in retrospect, I realized this was my first conscious lived experience of the truth of that statement. There are two races of men in this world, but only these two: the race of the decent man and the race of the indecent man. Both are found everywhere. They penetrate into all groups of society. No group consists entirely of decent or indecent people. And this, of course, applies equally to religious groups. Further affirmation was forthcoming when I first read Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, and I encountered Claudia Hammond's foreword to the book. She says, "The most challenging element of man's search for ultimate meaning for me is the emphasis on religion. Frankl defines religion in its broadest sense, but coming to the material without faith myself, and from a background in contemporary psychology, my initial reaction was to balk at the prominence he gives it. However, Frankl anticipates late 20th century research on the potential of religion to aid recovery from mental health problems. While I would disagree with his view that only psychiatrists possessing religious feelings of their own can do this, there have been recent calls for mental health professionals to have more training in discussing spirituality with clients. It is true that sometimes such discussions make practitioners feel uncomfortable. Frankl could be talking today when he describes patients feeling ashamed to mention their religion to their psychiatrists. So two elements of this really resonated with me. The first, obviously, being that a self-confessed atheist had penned the foreword to Frankl's book. The second is Hammond's disagreement with Frankl on the issue of non-religious mental health practitioners engaging with the subject of a client's religion. I hadn't encountered this stance before, and I was very surprised by it. My immediate thought was that surely, as logotherapists, we are to bring forth, illuminate, expand, and enliven everything that is meaningful to the individual client, particularly those elements of their lives which reside in the spiritual dimension. It seemed to me then, and does even more so now, impossible to avoid the part which faith and religious belief play in the discovery of spiritual meaning and purpose in a truly religious client's life. This sense was entrenched through the encounters with my very first study client, Imelda, who had lost 2 of her 3 adult children in the space of a few years. Living in a small village, we knew each other slightly before we started working together, and although I'm not sure how, I was aware that she was a deeply committed Christian, as was she of my equally committed atheism. This was not seen as an obstacle to our process by Imelda, who at the start of our first session announced with her characteristic forthrightness that she knew I didn't believe in God and had no problem with it. She trusted I would have no problem with the fact that she did. Well, with Frankl's assertion that a non-believer had no business engaging with the client's faith uppermost in mind, my immediate instinct was to end the session and to tell her that we unfortunately would not be a fit. Imelda, however, had blithely moved along, and before I knew it, we were already deeply engaged in our first logotherapeutic encounter. Imelda unwittingly provided me with my next great gift in my spiritual development, and that is the ability for me to accept the truth and inherent meaning in another individual's faith for them, while in no way questioning or shifting my own beliefs. Imelda's brand of Christianity is a constantly lived experience. She is a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, of which she is critical in many ways. Her relationship with God is visceral, tangible, and practical. She talks to him, laughs with him, gets annoyed with him, rails against him on occasion, and loves him deeply. She believes implicitly that he loves her and her children, both living and dead, unconditionally. I realized in our early encounters that the key to finding meaning and purpose in the suffering of her enormous losses lay in this relationship with God, and that in order for logotherapy to take place, Imelda's will to meaning needed to be fully activated through the powerful presence of God in her life. However, I was unsure how to proceed given Frankl's dictum, and so I just skirted around the issue for a few sessions. But one memorable day, one of the fundamental tenets of logotherapy, that of responding to the meaning of the moment during the client-therapist encounter, challenged me to make the only right and meaningful choice, which was to direct the Socratic dialogue towards the area of Imelda's faith. She was struggling to deal with her pain. And through this discussion and the logo hints she was dropping, suddenly I knew unequivocally where the problem lay. In responding to the moment, I instinctively, effortlessly, unself-consciously, and without in any way ascribing her beliefs to myself, found that self openly and honestly asking, how is your relationship with God right now? I did not say your God, but simply God. The meaning of the moment dictated that there could be no hint of judgment or irony in the question. Imelda's eyes widened with what I thought was surprise at my words, but it wasn't that. She accepted my question without question herself. Her facial expression was in response to the realization that we had correctly identified her meaning crisis. The power of this moment, I believe, supplied me with the ability to be 100% there for Amelda as her logotherapist. By avoiding the meaning inherent for her in her Christian faith, because I am not a Christian myself, would have rendered our encounters meaningless, and they would have had to end soon after. As it is, several years later, Amelda continues to see me on a weekly basis. We continue to talk about God in our sessions. She has never tried to convert me and has the utmost respect for my beliefs, which, as she frequently points out, are very similar to hers, just without God in the mix. None of this would have happened if I hadn't responded instinctively and truthfully to the meaning of a moment, which required only for me to address the issue of my client's faith with utter belief in the absolute meaning of that faith for her. She recently wrote in her journal, "I have become rock solid through logotherapy. Chipping out and shaping this rock as my life roller coaster keeps on climbing the steep ups and hitting the free-falling drops that constantly strengthen my faith and my passion for life within my relationship with God. I'm also constantly building my relationship with my logotherapist, who points out when I lose track and take my eyes and focus off God. This is true to his calling, as he himself is not a Christian, but he has the insight to guide me back to my core belief. Today, I work with many clients of varying spiritual beliefs. If the logo hints point to those beliefs being central to the client's will to meaning, I work with them. My interest in this aspect of logotherapy led me to conduct some research with a group of clients of varying beliefs, some of who were aware of my spiritual beliefs and some who were not. The results of this research show that clients are not concerned with the beliefs of their logotherapist, even if they are aware that those beliefs differ from theirs. They are concerned only with the logotherapist's ability to guide them towards the discovery of their unique meaning and purpose through to the discernment of what is meaningful for them, the client. For myself, as a logotherapy practitioner, I now sit very comfortably and with ever more conviction in my atheism, which encompasses a deeply lived spiritual dimension and a proudly meaningful relationship with my unconscious God, for which I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Viktor Frankl, Dr. Turiya Chantal, and my client, Amelda. Thank you.
Excellent, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark, that was very courageous.
Sorry, I'm a bit emotional now.
Yeah, very courageous, very brave. Thank you for wearing your heart on your sleeve. We really do appreciate it. And Mark, I've come to know you over the years, and it's great to know a person and you kind of know where they are, but you don't know where they came from. Mm-hmm. And it's nice for you to share that and to share and acknowledge what life is about. I think one of the things that I've always had is always, I say, it's one simple thing. Put your shoes, come into the shoes of the person that you're engaging with. It's really that simple. We cannot be prescriptive. So we might call ourselves a logotherapist, a neurologist, an ologist of some kind. But it's not for us to be prescriptive. It's for us to observe and to know the client that sits in front of you or the person that simply sits in front of you. Put yourself into their shoes. And the one simple word is listen. And I think that what it's all about is listening to the person on the other end. And I've got a lecture about first contact. And in the first contact is also to kind of know or build on what your client's background is. Everyone has different cultures, different beliefs. And I think it's is to have what I call an open-ended idea. So we all have ideas. I am not an atheist. You are. You have a sexual orientation different to mine. That doesn't matter because you're not discussing that. We're discussing the specific subject or logo hint at that point of engagement. And there might be one or three or four. And you then address that and put yourself into that person's shoes, sit opposite them and sit and think of them looking at you. You have to then have this face of listening. And you did that exercise with us, Mark, about that, about the subconscious and how we are, as actors, you explained it to us. And I think it's so true. But coming back to it's actually simple. Put yourself in a place of somebody else's shoes. You know all the theory, but you don't know the practice because you don't know. And every single case, every single session is unique in its own because there are new exploratories, there are new things that happen. Every single session is brand new. And I think that's what's so exciting about life, is that every session is new and exciting. And you discovered logotherapy, and logotherapy discovered you. And all of those things, that's all wonderful. But you had to do your research first, Mark. You had to come to the realization. But the realization is actually very, very simple. And I really, really enjoyed the session with you tonight, Mark. Thank you for being so brave. Thank you for being so courageous. So thank you for the message.
Thank you, Sean. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's true that one of the most exciting things about working in logotherapy is the uniqueness of each encounter, and it's also pretty terrifying sometimes. Not going in and not knowing where you're going to go and what's going to happen. But it's also the great joy of it, and when one is able to connect with a client on that deeply spiritual level, and you find yourself asking questions and coming up with things, and you get to the end of the session and you go, I don't even know where that came from. But the knowledge that you realize with what we carry inside ourselves, it's probably one of the most exciting things I've ever experienced.
I'm just going to give you a scientific situation and say to you, it's called cognitive bias. So our brains are wired for cognitive bias, and that's exactly what happens. So if you get involved in cognitive bias, which is always there, our bodies are made for negativity. We have the stress response. We have the HPA axis for stress, flight, fight, or freeze. It's there, but where's the positivity? And it doesn't mean necessarily positivity in the true sense of the word, but it's just being more realistic and always think laterally. And I think that's one of the things that you've come to realize. And if we think laterally, we can overcome the cognitive bias in our brain. I'm being very technical, but that's actually quite simple.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Hi, Mark. It's Sue.
Hi, Sue.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Mark. I didn't know anything about you. So hearing your story really has moved me greatly. It really has. And I thank you for that. And,
Yes.
what you actually said about two races of men, when I was in Poland going through the different concentration camps, somehow I kept meeting up with survivors. And people began to laugh because they were forever seeing me walking or somebody coming up to me and starting to talk. And I realized that some of them were deeply religious. Others had such hatred towards any religion, but they had lived moral lives. And that to me was the greatest thing, that their moral compass was so strong. Their core was so strong, just to have survived that even and still be able to reach out to others. To me, that meant so much. And that's why your talk tonight has really also meant so much to me. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Sue. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
I add one little thing.
Yes, Carl.
Firstly, of course, thank you so much for sharing. I've known you for a little while now and a little bit about you, but this certainly adds so many more dimensions, and I'm privileged to have heard them, and thank you for that. What struck me about your whole story is your clarity. I look back, if one looks back on one's life and the way you've described your life, the clarity you have about what you've experienced and what you've been through and how you've translated that and where you've arrived is extraordinary. I'd love to talk more about that with you sometime. that, you can look back and realize where those changes came, why they came, who they came through, your deeper and deeper levels of understanding. That clarity is quite unique. And as you say, it started at a very young age.
Thank you, Coral. But the real clarity only came with logotherapy. My life was, this is only a little bit of it. My life was a complete mess, really, until 10 years ago, in many ways. And I almost feel now that, my religion is logotherapy, because it really, I had no idea that I could reach, live on the level that I'm living now. It never occurred to me for so many years, and I'm just grateful that I found it in time. That it's never too late to also shift one's. I think what had happened to me as a very young man was that I became very angry with religion because of what it said about me, and with that came this absolute rejection of anything to do with spirituality. And even though I kind of knew it was irrational, it was almost like a flag that I had to fly, and being able to let go of that and go, I really can be spiritual, and also I can be spiritual and an atheist at the same time. That has been a wonderful thing for me. And one of the things, Taria she was the one who really helped me with that. She kept saying to me when I went in my first year at UNISA, every time I would say something about an atheist, she would write in the margin, "You're not an atheist." And eventually I said to her, Dr. Chantal, that's a little bit insulting. I am an atheist. I really, really am. And I know what you're saying. You're saying that I seem to have a belief in a thing, but it's not. I want to be. And she would say, "Don't label yourself." And I said, "But you label yourself as Jewish. I want to label myself as an atheist." But she showed me then, and then she went, "Okay, but let's look at how do you reconcile this obviously deep spiritual side of yourself that you have and which you've been pushing away for 50 odd years." And she was the one who really provided me with the tools to be able to do that. I'm sorry she's not here this evening. I know she wanted to come, but I don't think she is here.
Mark, you mentioned that word letting go. Did bringing logotherapy into your life in the way that it happened, was that the catalyst that allowed you to not so much let go, but be freed of what was holding you back?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I was imprisoned by so many thoughts and ideas that I'd, created, and many for myself, and doggedly hung on to. And logotherapy really, logotherapy has been a life-altering experience for me.
I think that's why Viktor Frankl says that the right up till the moment of death is important, because that can happen in that moment, and that's what it's about.
Yeah.
Well, that's the opportunity that exists in that moment.
Yeah. And it's so exciting as we get older and, to now be in one's 60s and go, wow, there's all this opportunity still waiting for me. It's not about winding down and slowing down and retreating from life. It's about walking ever more through it and into it and getting involved with it. It's very exciting.
Wait until you get to 70. It's very exciting.
I can't wait.
Very exciting.
Mark, can I ask you some questions related to specific cases?
Yes.
When it comes to spirituality and it comes to atheism, which we do want to put aside, what happens, or what have you experienced when you come across a hospice patient, a trauma, in that kind of a very difficult situation when they are on, let's call it, on their last legs, for a simple term? How have you engaged with that? How have you dealt with it? A. B, how is it with your children? in terms of how do you deal with that? So just some random questions, but I'd like to know cases you have, or what you can tell us about that.
So always for me is that, obviously people who are facing end of life scenarios and things like that are generally, facing some sort of spiritual crisis or an examination of their spirituality. And all. So it's always for me absolutely essential to find out where the core of their spiritual meaning lies, and what gives their life spiritual meaning and purpose, and to work with bolstering always the meaningful, the enlightening, for people who are not religious. I would, so for example, in the hospice case, you turn then to what are the scopes of free action that are available to you on a spiritual level. And, while one is never going to say to a client, oh, there are some advantages to having a terminal illness, you can point towards the things like you have an opportunity here that many people do not have, because a lot of us don't know when we're going to die. But now, and so you have the opportunity to do many things, to make peace with people you need, to make sure that your loved ones know how you feel about them, to make sure that you've expressed that love, to provide the space for them to express love for you. I think love is probably the most important thing that comes into play in the spiritual dimension, and that's it, whether one is religious or not. So I didn't quite understand your question about my children.
I'm saying about children in general and your children based on experience there. I'm just talking about children. I'm not pointing to your children specifically, but I know you got children. But I'm saying how do you deal with it with children? How do you deal with these spiritual dimensions with children? And I'm just interested to know.
I don't really, because I think Frankel said, with children under, are we talking about children, very young children? Or I tend to avoid, I don't work with young children, because, I have a fear that engaging with the spiritual dimension is something that is difficult for them to comprehend. So I'm very wary of that. I don't get there. I do work a lot with young adults, but there's no problem. So, yeah, no, I'm always very wary of seeing if there is a client who I don't believe that logotherapy is going to help them in that moment, or they are in a situation where it's very difficult to access the spiritual dimension. Then I tend to back off and refer them to somebody else or something like that.
Thank you for your honesty. There's a hand up from Sharon.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Mark, and everybody else. Mark, I want to just thank you from the bottom of my heart for the reminder about Frankel's view about God and consciousness and unconsciousness, because I think actually I'm working now in an environment of recovery and rehabilitation with people with dependency issues, and the program is based in a 12-step framework. And so many people struggle with the concept of God. And even then, the concept of a higher power, because there seems to be always some kind of religious connotation of that higher power in terms of a framing of being a religious God. Very often a Christian God, but there's a religious God. And so just reminding me, that God is unconscious insofar as our relationship to God is unconscious. That is something that I'd actually forgotten. And so I think just how powerful that can be, to just in terms of accessing our spiritual dimension, that there is this unconscious relationship that we have with God, and we maybe come to our understanding of God in whatever way makes sense to us or doesn't make sense to us, actually, is what I'm also thinking about. And so that sometimes that's something we have to grapple with.
Yeah.
And that's okay. So
Thanks.
thank you.
It's wonderful to hear, you saying that working in a situation with a 12-step program, because I've seen a lot of people, and the 12-step program is wonderful in many ways, but I've seen a lot of people flounder, which I did, simply because I couldn't get past that one thing. It was almost like I felt a little bit like I wasn't worthy enough of recovery, and so again, like I would actually, not that I want to go back to having a drinking problem, but it would be lovely now to be able to go back and do the 12-step program from where I am now, and have the ability to know what my higher power is and what my unconscious God is.
God is, yeah. I mean, I know that for me in the work that I'm doing, I mean, I'm learning and growing in this work. I haven't been so entrenched in this population, I don't know, since I was in my very first encounter with being a psychotherapist when I was in my late 20s, not in my second encounter. But, and then even then in my second encounter, it was in a light way, whereas right now it's in a really deeply, deeply meaningful space. And, I mean, I often reframe higher power in terms of something that's outside of us that can be helpful to us, whatever that is.
That's a great way of framing it. If someone had said that to me, I think that would have helped me a lot.
And so yet at the same time, what I'm sitting with is this notion of, and there's the spiritual dimension, so to speak of something that's outside of me that can be helpful to me. And then I'm just thinking how in terms of accessing that spiritual dimension, and that is this unconscious relationship that we're having even with the spirit, with the spiritual dimension that very often we're grappling with, but we don't even know we're grappling with that.
That's what I was doing for most of my life.
And so, I mean, I'm just sitting with a client at the moment who I gave Man's Search for Meaning to read, and how he comes with this book, and he's so highly intelligent, far more intelligent than I am, and he's really grappling with all of these different elements that Frankl writes about, and we're having these conversations, and it's just so, I'm like, oh, I'm so glad I'm able to find a way to access and bring in logotherapy into the space, and to learn and grow in that space.
It's
So
wonderful.
Really, thank
that.
you for the reminder about our relationship is at an unconscious level with God.
Thanks, Sharon. Appreciate that. What is the time? Are we? Oh, gosh. Thank you so much, to everybody who came and who stayed the course.
Thank you, Mark. That was
Thank
really
you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank
you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Sonia. We'll chat soon.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.